Is that right? Good.
Is my microphone on?
Oh, great, you're
amazing. Hello everybody. Hello everybody. Apologies that I'm late. I live in the deep parts of Kent, so getting here was a little bit difficult. Too difficult, actually. My name's Anita by me. I am going to be moderating this panel, and my lovely guests here with me. Nice to see your faces. Honestly, I've only seen you guys on paper, so it's actually really nice to see your faces. But I'll let you all introduce yourselves one by one. If you just give us a lowdown of your name and what you do, and we'll take it from there. So, Simon?
Thanks, Anita. So I was going to start. So my name's Simon Levine. I'm the global CEO at DLA Piper, which is a global law firm. I appreciate looking at the four of us. You'd never guess which one's the lawyer on the panel, would you? Because I'm the one in this, you look great, all of you, and I look like the stiff. But I did work for many years in the media and sports industry. For 30 years, I was an intellectual property lawyer. I've worked across lots of the media industry, but also a lot of the sports industry, most notably probably for the Premier League for 20 years. But now, for the past 8 years, I've been running a global law firm with 11,000 people in it, in a business that has had to work hard, a sector that's got to work very hard, particularly in things like social mobility. So maybe we'll talk a bit about that at some point.
Afternoon, I'm Leon Braithwaite. I'm an educator for Show Us and the Red Card, also a former professional football player for about 9 years. Also help little kids with their mental skills in football. So really honoured to be here today and talking about this issue of racism within sport.
My name's Derek Bardwell. I am the CEO of 10 Years Time. We are philanthropy advisors. I'm also the author of a book called No in Race, which looks at racism and race in Britain through the prism of sport, and Giving Back, which reimagines philanthropy through a reparative lens.
Hi everyone. Hi Anita. Good to be here. My name's Simone Pound. I am Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion for the PFA, which is the Professional Footballers Association, which is the players' union. So represent players across the UK, work closely with other stakeholders in the game and other stakeholders involved in kind of tackling discrimination.
Amazing, thank you. Can I get a round of applause for all of our panelists? Thank you. You're all really kind. I can see a lot of smiles on their faces as well, so this should be a nice little panel that we've got going on. So this is amazing. So the first kind of big question is kind of a in-your-face kind of question, but is how big is this problem of racism in sport as it stands today? And Simone, I'll start with you and we'll just go around the table.
Okay, so, without being cliched, it's a problem that is across society. It's a systemic societal issue that presents itself in sport. It presents itself in my sport, which is football. We've seen really recently players taking a really strong stance with taking the knee, just to really highlight the issues that they face and society faces. So yeah, it's there, it's endemic, and it's something that we continue to strive to address.
And Derek, and yourself, how big is this problem of racism to you personally?
Well, we exist in a country that still doesn't acknowledge colonialism, empire, or slavery. We're in a country that still thinks that race, believes in race science. We're in a country that believes that racism is still an individual act and not a systemic act. So, sport might pretend that it's got something different about it, but it's simply a branch of what happens in society. And so for me, it's like, okay, I want sport to do better because it's got higher levels of representation in certain sports. But let's not make any mistakes to say that, sport is some outlier to what's happening in society. So for me, the scale of this is huge because it's global, it's universal, it's historic. So yeah, I think it's a huge and as big as anything.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It's more than just a sports issue. It's a kind of a systematic issue that needs to be addressed. And Leon and yourself, to the problem of racism, how big is it for you?
Yeah, to echo that, you've got to think about historically laws were written to hold a certain people down, certain cultural people down. That's not going to stop. So when talking about racism in sport, well, why would it stop? When you got people who don't own things, there's no ownership. So for me, it's going to be there. No matter what you do, you can't change the education system because it starts with education. And that's what we do, is show racism recovery. We try and go into school and inform people, but you only get in one part of the education, the part that they want you to hear, and not the part that you should know. You know, we talking about, we have Black History Month, which should be history. Why is it Black History Month? Do we have White History Month? And and the history they teach you is small. They don't teach you about the grand. They don't do things to uplift people of different cultures. So for me, it's very, very, very systemic.
And that's actually quite gospel there, because I would say I'm fairly young. I like to call myself fairly young, but I was in school not too long ago and learning about Black History Month, and there were so many things that just wasn't told to me, and I'm hearing about these things through the internet, and I'm like, oh my God, I never knew these things actually happened. But yeah, you're right in that respect. And Simon, how do you kind of scale the problem of racism in society at the moment, and in sports, of course?
I think a couple of things. Firstly, I agree with everything that's been said. I want to put a slightly different perspective on it as well, and either this will go well or it'll go badly, but I'm going to do it anyway. We've done a lot of work in relation to that DLA Piper. It's part of our values, and one of the things we do a lot is reverse mentoring, and to do reverse mentoring, I said, well, as the CEO, I should do that first. And I was talking to a wonderful young gentleman in our organisation, and I said, well, tell me about me. And so he said, well, you know, I mean, you're the CEO, and I expect you earn quite a lot of money, and you're a middle-class white guy, and you probably went to Oxbridge. I did. I went to Cambridge. And he said, that's what we need to know. I said, do you think I could understand anything about racism? He said, no. And I said, well, okay, let me just tell you about my growing up, because I grew up in a place called Hull, which is an interesting place on the northeast. I'm a Jewish guy. I went to school. The game that was most played at break time was called Jew Scramble. You take some coins, you throw them up in the air, you all scramble for the money because Jews are greedy. Pretty awful, right? When you're the kid in school, there weren't many Jews in Hull, when you're the kid standing there. I also understand what it's like to feel like an outsider or being put down or whatever. And I think one of the problems, and I agree with everything that's been said, it's a massive problem. It's a societal issue, not just sport is simply reflecting what you see in society, is there's too much unconscious bias. There's too much bigotry. There's too much set positions. There's not enough communication. I do think education is huge. I sit on the board of something called the Office for Students, which is the regulator of all the universities in this country. And it's a massive issue. The free speech thing is a massive issue. The issue of some people take the free speech banner and they assume that means they can say things that are frankly simply wrong and frankly, in my view, illegal and shouldn't happen. So I think there's a massive societal issue we have. Sport simply reflects that societal issue, and I think, you know, it needs role models to stand up and organisations to take a stand on this.
I'm totally with you there, and you know what? There's these little innuendos and these little games that people have, and it's kind of a jab at a race, right? And I remember growing up, and there's always these little jabs, these little games and stuff. And me personally, I can't help but laugh at it. I just like, ugh, here we go again type of thing. And it's one of those ones where growing up, I've noticed a shift and I've noticed a change. And it's not a great change, it's not a huge change, but we're going in the right direction. And Leon, I'll come to you for the next question, is on the pitch and off the pitch, right? We've seen players taking a knee, we've seen managers speaking up for black players, etc. Have you kind of seen a shift in what we call the perception of racism on and off the pitch, or do you think there's still a long way to go?
There's a long way to go. You see it, take the World Cup. Harry Kane missed a penalty, not much backlash. The 3 young men who missed a penalty in the Euros, massive backlash. And that's off the top of what Rashford done for raising money to give kids free school meals. Didn't see race, culture, didn't see anything apart from human beings. So for him to get that backlash, but then Harry Kane missed a penalty, he's doing his job, missed a penalty, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So it just shows where we're at. So it hasn't changed. I think it's got worse because there's more platform. People are out there.
Yeah. And please feel free. Do any of you agree? Do you agree, Derek, for example? Do you agree with what Leon has to say in that sentiment?
Yeah, I mean, I don't you know, I mean, I worked in sport for a little bit, mainly in the sort of sport for development field, and it was, for me, the world was very insular, you know, and being in there was, you know, if you had something to say in it, then you would probably be moved and shuttled out, you know. What I don't ever see at the moment, to Leon's point, is there's no real rebalancing of the power in terms of who, you know, there's lots of images of people of colour on the front of reports, publications, but the people that are writing the checks are actually still the same. The way in which owners get to own clubs and the criteria and the due diligence that's required in order for that to happen or to host, all of that is still the same. So, you know, we know that racism mutates, we know that that changes, and it changes through the lines of the people that hold the power. And if the people that hold the power are exactly the same, then essentially the conversations that when I was writing about being a kid when I was in the 1980s, it might look slightly different now to what it is, but actually it's just the same thing that we're experiencing. And I come back to this, you know, and I know we're talking about sport, but, you know, as someone that's got a 12-year-old son, and seeing him having to negotiate ways in which he deals with the institution of racism and structural racism 40 years on is tragic, because it's not a lifestyle thing, it's a life and death, it's a life chances thing for many young people in this country. So, you know, if sport is going to be that platform to be able to, even if symbolically, at the moment it's very performative, but even if symbolically is to contribute to this, then it's got to contribute to it in a very meaningful way, not a symbolic or a performative way.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Derek, but can you give us an example of what would be a meaningful way?
A meaningful way. So let's just take, for example, if you are going to become an owner of a club, for example, then what's your criteria? You know, what is your track record of, you know, anti-racist practices in your organization or diversity in your organization? You know, what's the criteria that enables you to be able to own that particular club? We have seen parts of that in the States where some of that becomes, you know, the reason why you would get that. I think also in terms of how you start to centralize DEI, anti-racism, whatever it might be, how does that become as central to your business as opposed to being something that's on the periphery? And then also, I would also add, who are the experts that are coming in to be able to do that? Because as I said, my experience of sport was that everything was still very insular, and people that got to come into it were very much the mates of those that owned. So actually, who are the experts that were advising on how some of these things are centralized?
I feel like it's only right to bring you in here, Simone. Seeing as we're talking about experts right at the top, and obviously you being at the top in the PFA as well, obviously, how have you seen a change in the way racism is handled? And obviously more to kind of Derek's point, who are the experts? Who's going to be enforcing these changes? Is it meaningful? Can we get to a point where it's going to be meaningful?
It's a really interesting debate and conversation. I've worked in my role for 2 decades, 22 football seasons, so I've seen a lot of change. I've seen the landscape evolve, but still I see the issues that we were debating 20 years ago persisting. So lack of representation in coaching and management, underrepresentation of South Asian male professionals, lack of visible gay male role models. So, but I don't want to be really kind of negative, because I also think it's really important to acknowledge the progress and the way that the sport has evolved, the way that the players have evolved. I think that whilst organisations like Show Racism, the Red Card, and Kick Racism Out of Football, as it was in the 90s when they were founded, both due to the kind of overt racism that black players were experiencing on the pitch, we've kind of seen now kind of legislative change in terms of the work that's being done with football clubs. And I'm not here to kind of sing the praises of the whole football industry, but I am, you know, there has been some progress, whether that's the Football Leadership Diversity Code, whether that's the kind of kick it out equality standard, whether that's the fantastic work that Show Racism the Red Card does, working at kind of grassroots level with young people and young kids. So you have to kind of, that you have to acknowledge what is going on, but equally it's not enough. The change is kind of not significant enough or impactful enough. And in terms of experts, again, I guess, if I've been in this field for the length of time that I have, I also feel that it's such a journey, and the whole kind of tackling discrimination is such a kind of lifelong commitment, and people from before us have done what we're doing. So it's something that you just have to kind of continue to challenge and work on and pass the baton on, so that you can hopefully see some amount and levels of change.
I think there's an area of change an area where I haven't seen much change in my short living span. I haven't seen much change, and that's kind of like being a fan. So I'm a Chelsea fan. If any Chelsea fans here? Yeah. Ooh. There's an Arsenal fan on this panel. I won't say who, but Simon. So I'm a Chelsea fan, and going to matches, sometimes it could be a little bit daunting because there's a history with Chelsea, right? There's a history of black players being taunted at Chelsea, black fans not being let on trains and stuff. And my dad and my mum, they say the wickedest prayer whenever I go to a Chelsea match. It's unbelievable how many, I would say the longest times in 45 minutes before kickoff, I'm on the phone to my mum like, amen, amen. And I'm rolling my eyes, right? And it's really hilarious, but there's a problem there, and it's like sitting there in fan culture, being a fan of the team that I love, but having to have these 45-minute prayers before kickoff is still a problem today. And Simon, I'll come to you as an Arsenal fan. I know you have a story to tell, and I wasn't in the meeting when you shared this story, and I would love for you to share this story and of how you've been an Arsenal fan and hearing kind of anti-Semitic chants, especially when you're with your son.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were talking about it a couple of days ago, and I mean, just, and I will tell my story, I mean, just, it was interestingly in the point you made, I mean, it occurred to me as well, the way in which Bukayo Saka was treated after the Euros, I was at that Euro final, was beyond upsetting. Actually, the nicest kid ever. I mean, he's just a wonderful, wonderful, talented player and a lovely person, and to be treated like that is just awful. And the strength he showed to actually come back from that in the way he is was brilliant. And then you saw what happened the other night. So I want to endorse what you said. So I've seen all, like you would see home and away. I am an Arsenal supporter. I've been to some away games too, and you do see all forms of inappropriate behaviour, racism, misogyny, attacks. I mean, Arsenal, like a lot of football clubs, have got a really great campaign going for LGBT fans, although you don't see that in players, as you said, it's not coming out in that way. And the story I was saying the other day was one about anti-Semitism, just because, Arsenal's obviously great rivals are Tottenham. Tottenham supporters as well use the Y word, which is hardly very helpful in my view, to put it mildly, and inappropriate. But, my son has been going with me since he's 5, he's 26 now, and he's seen Arsenal. He went to watch the Invincibles. He's watched his slow downhill curve for 20 years. But never know, it may come back the top of the league this season. But, we'd go to the game.
He had to sneak that in.
Yeah, just thought I'd say it because I've got a Chelsea person. Listen, how often do you ever get to say that as an Arsenal supporter, right? But on to a more serious thing. We used to go to the games at the Emirates and to Highbury before that. And my son was very good at a tune. Like all kids, he wanted to sing the songs. He wanted to understand what the songs were and sing them. And then you get the thing about, we hate Tottenham and all that stuff. And at the end, they go, you do. And then you say, well, what's that, Dad? And it's the most excruciatingly, to the point you made about your son as 12 and having to go through schooling. I'm sure it's much worse than that even. But how, as a parent, do you explain that? Where do you even start explaining that when kids of 5 and 6, 7, 12, they start off life with hope, and they don't start off racist. They don't start off homophobic. They don't have a problem with misogyny. They learn that somewhere, which is the societal point. So that has bothered me a long time. And you mentioned something about, the law. Maybe we'll come on to it or not. I'm not here to totally talk about the law, though we can talk about the online harm bill. But at the risk of sounding like probably the oldest person on this panel, social media is a problem. It is a massive problem, and I've seen it in my personal life, I've seen it in my professional life. I've even seen it, believe it or not, as the CEO of a law firm. Hard to believe, but when things happen, people will always look to then, work out who you are and what they can attack you for. And I do think there has to be, whatever the law is, people have got to start taking it seriously about enforcing it. You can write anything you want in the law, but if social media companies are not out there actually taking stuff down, and if people who are at stadiums who are chanting stuff where the stewards can see them and the stewards are just turning the other way, you're never going to make progress with this. We have to start making examples of people, in my view.
You're right, you almost took my job there, because I was going to start talking about online abuse. No, it's absolutely fine, because what you said is completely irrelevant and is extremely valid, and we will come back to you about that, especially from a law perspective. And kind of, Leon, I'll come to you with this one. So online abuse, how would you say it's contributed to the fight against racism? So for me, being like a Gen Z babe, like I use Twitter, I use Instagram, and I call people out consistently. If you are racist, I will call you out, and I will, if you don't mean it, I will DM you to the side and say, listen, this is what you said that, could be deemed offensive. Here's how you could have said it better, and I do things like that, but there's still kind of a whole swarm of people online that are dishing out abuse. So how would you say it's contributed to the fight against racism?
Massively, because there's no repercussions. For these acts of racism via social media, there's no repercussions. People can hide behind whatever A-listers they want. So what's going to change? Unless the governing bodies or these owners start making it a criminal offence to put things up like this on the site, then it's going to continue. It's going to get worse because people can come behind.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm going to come in because this has been too much of a big part of my life since 2019, when we started the kind of Enough campaign to address the online abuse of players. So I would say, back in the day, like we were talking about when Kick It Out and Show Racism Red Card were founded, and you had the kind of abuse of players, which was horrific, bananas being thrown on pitches, monkey chants. Now we have horrific abuse, whether it's using emojis as a form of abuse. We've seen a third of kind of discriminatory abuse being emojis being used. We see vile kind of slurs against women, and we know we have the Women's Euros and the kind of abuse that players receive them. We've talked about the Euros and the backlash of those poor guys who took those penalties. So it's just been endemic and just been something that we've been addressing. The players were really strong, did a kind of boycott. So the first was in 2019. We did a 24-hour boycott, came off all of the platforms. That at least got them to the table, so they started to kind of have conversations and dialogue with us. Although it was unfortunately just talk, because even when we did 3 different data sets of reports, they still didn't really rise to the challenges that we needed them to. The next boycott was a weekend-long boycott, which included, as well as players, we had the clubs involved, broadcasters, sponsors, fans, and yet still no change. So it's in the hands of government now with the Online Harms Bill. We work really closely with the police, so there's all sorts of things around malicious communications acts. I feel like I know I've got this law wrapped up when it comes to abuse of players online. So trust me, it's something that we're really trying to address and tackle, but they're such massive global giants, these platforms, and we've just recently obviously had Elon Musk buy out Twitter, and we had a lot of abuse over the weekend, and so much of it is still up, even though we've asked them to take it down. It just beggars belief.
That is so important to me, because I use Twitter as like my home. I don't watch the news, I watch Twitter, right? Gen Z again. Gen Z, right? I watch Twitter, so the things that I actually see on Twitter, it can be so damaging. And Derek, I'll come to you here. How can we kind of educate through social media about racism? And if the Twitter platforms, the Instagram platforms, Facebook platforms are not taking down racism or taking it into their own hands, how do we take it into our own hands ourselves?
I mean, God, when I go on social media, it makes me just vex most of the time, if I'm being completely honest. And you know it's because they are taking you to the extreme of yourself. In the way that it operates, it's taken to extremes. But it feels like to me that, so I used to, well, I'm not used to, I am still a West Ham football fan because that's where I grew up, which meant that I went to West Ham football matches in the 1980s. And if you want anything as vile as being in Upton Park as it was then in the 1980s, that was the single most disempowering experience you could ever imagine, because every type of abuse laid on would be there. And I haven't gone to a football match probably for about 3 years, gone to Crystal Palace. I didn't experience anything while I was there with my son. So I don't know, I know it's still prevalent, but I didn't sort of experience it at that time. But my assumption is that it's just been replaced by the abuse that happens on social media now. So yeah, I absolutely think that, you know, we can stop using those platforms, but you need to do that en masse, that you need to protest. But I always urge people to read this book called Dark Money by Jane Meyer, which looks at, you know, incredibly wealthy people and what they have done to preserve their wealth. And so much of the preservation of wealth is based on deregulation and ensuring that there is no one that can stop them, be it tech firms, be it fossil fuel companies, whoever, that the government can't intervene to stop them from really regulating how they run their business and how they earn their profits. So for me, my assumption with the social media platforms is that in terms of regulation, that's where you need to hit it. And if you can't hit it from that point, then there's probably a really good reason in terms of who owns the power why we can't do that. So, yeah.
There's only so much we can do, isn't there? Honestly, there's actually only so much we can do. And I do implore everyone here to, if you are a social media head like myself, I do love Twitter, I do love Instagram, but kind of use your platform to empower and kind of tackle the battle with racism. So if you see something, speak up, report it, say something. And obviously Elon Musk is in power now, which is controversial, to say the least, but there are still platforms out there that are willing to kind of help you and kind of fight with you. And Simon, I'll come to you, because I don't know anything to do with the law and online abuse, right? And this is more going to be educational for myself and a lot of people here listening as well, especially from the Euros last year. How has the legislature changed in terms of online abuse, and how are you and your company tackling online racial abuse as well?
So the issue, I mean, you probably know more than me probably, but the issue is, I mean, I'll talk a bit about the law, but the issue is in some ways not the law. In fact, in the 30 odd years I've been involved in, well, just being a lawyer in various types of sectors and seen how the law stops wrongdoing. The fact of the matter is, often, even if the law is right, and by the way, law tends to play catch up. That's one of the problems, because you think, if you think of like even the online harm bill or some of the laws that exist now in relation to social media, it is trying to deal with what they know, not where it's going. And in some ways, you need to be ahead of the game. But the problem is more one of how you enforce it. So let me just explain what I mean by that. There are absolutely laws out there. You mentioned some of them earlier in terms of people being abusive at matches, and the online harms bill is going through Parliament at the moment, and part of the intention of that is certainly to try and deal with some of the issues we've talked about. But let's take the practical situation that we've had in relation to some of our clients who tend to be governing sport bodies in relation to sport, but we've had it in other sectors. And my colleague Dan out there, you can speak to later, has written a lovely paper on this. He's wonderful, wonderful work. The practical problem is this, and I think one of the panelists mentioned it earlier, you've got to be able to find who does this to start with. It is too easy at the moment for people to register using a particular name. They pretend to be someone else. There's no real identification going on as to who's using social media. Even if you could do something like that, often people will be using VPNs, or they'll be redirecting, or it's coming from another part of the world, or people manage to get it routed through another part of the world. Because if you're, a lot of this stuff is from people who just are saying things that are horrific, but they're not even thinking about what they're doing, or if they are, they're just doing it. But some of this is more orchestrated than that. There's plenty of organisations and people out there who are looking to cause societal rift to the point where it's much more organised than that. And so it doesn't just need the laws in this country to get a grip of it. Even if the online harms bill makes some, progress, The European Union have got to do something. The US have got to do something about it. You know, I don't want to get overly political about the World Cup at the moment, but you only have to look at, you know, lots of other countries have other views or operate laws that are not in line with maybe the standards that we have. And there has to be a coming together. And what I would say is, therefore, yes, the law, and if the online harm bill comes in, will help. It will absolutely help some of this stuff. But ultimately, you've got to be identify people. You've got to be able to enforce against them. You've got to have what I call the wrong role models. In other words, you've got to have examples is better than role models. You've got to have examples of people that you can make sure people understand what is coming their way if they keep behaving like this. And then you've got to do a lot with education as well. You really have to do a lot more with education. And my only point about governments more generally, other than the fact that I think laws have got to work better across the world, it's not just about this country, my only point is we are voters. People do have an opportunity of putting pressure on politicians to a degree. Maybe they'll listen, maybe they won't. But I don't know at the moment if enough pressure is being put on politicians to do something about this stuff. It's just too easy to sidestep it and say it's too hard, because ultimately the owners of any of these platforms may or may not be people who are doing the right thing. But if the governments regulate and enforce in the right way collectively, it would force them to do it whether they like it or not.
Totally understand that, and this is not to put you under pressure or on the spot, but I look at what happened with the 2021 Euros and in the final, and I think, how much more pressure do we have to put on the government for things to change?
Well, that's a really fair point. I mean, you'd think after that they would, but of course the problem is it's not just what people, it's getting the headlines, it's getting the press. It was in the press, but how long was it in the press for before someone then moved to whatever the next event was? I know we've been through a pandemic and there's all sorts of other things, but at the end of the day, I do think there has to be it has to be a mix of people keeping up the concerted effort, pressure groups, and also the media. I do think the media have a big role to play in all of this because they heavily, heavily influence people. And the reaction of whatever the headlines are to a penalty miss is going to be quite instructive as to what some people out there do.
That's actually a very good point. So I work for the media. I work for a media company in sports.
I wasn't having a go.
No, it's fine, it's fine. You threw me off just then. No, it's fine, it's fine. No, I totally understand because after the Euros myself, it was probably the first time I've ever had to kind of stand up for myself in my job and say, I'm not printing this, I'm not writing this, I'm not writing about it. Do not force me to write about this, because if I write about it, you're not going to like what I write, first of all. But secondly, it's just kind of reliving the trauma all over again. And I feel like players, fans often are forced to relive their trauma. And this is so bad, Leon, because I'm about to make you relive your trauma. But as a player, as a former player as well, has there been any instances of racism? And have there been instances where you felt like you've been helped by the law, or you've been helped by kind of individuals within the club maybe?
There's always going to be instances. I'm quite fortunate that my parents are quite strong and told me that people are entitled to their opinions. It doesn't mean they're right, but they're entitled to their opinions. So if you can have that kind of mindset, you can tackle anything, right? But not everyone's like me. So I often talk about the monkey chants. I disassociate myself with it because I'm not a monkey. So if the players started to have a little bit more knowledge about themselves, it wouldn't bother them. Because if I ask the crowd, who are they chanting at? Everyone's going to say, presumably black people. What, are there not white monkeys out there? I've never seen a monkey play football in the Premiership. So it doesn't bother me. I've had that, so my lecturer there, Floyd, and we had a conversation, and I said, when I told him that, he went, what do you mean? I said, well, I haven't seen a monkey play football. I'm not a monkey. Darwin dispelled that myth. I'm an educated man, so I know that. So it doesn't bother me, personally, because Tarzan, what colour's Tarzan? He's white, right? He talks to... so it makes sense. So you can do that as long as you want, as much as you want. If you know they hit the sign, then we've got a problem. But monkey chant, I'm not a monkey. I don't associate myself with a monkey. So again, that's me being an educated man, looking at the history books and looking at Darwin's myth and mythology and stuff like that. But again, racism will always be there. It depends on how strong you are, because I'm sure it can turn people to mental health issues. God knows Saka's a strong boy, because and you've got a good family unit, because that stuff that he took at the Euros was appalling. Yeah.
I can't stop laughing at the fact that you said, well, I haven't seen a monkey play football before, so who are you chanting at? I'm actually going to use that. The next time I hear someone chanting a monkey chant at my stadium, I'm going to be like, well, where's the monkey? I can't see it. Absolutely great advice from you there, Leon. And kind of looking at players like Bukayo Saka, Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, etc., all these young kind of black players, would you say that their kind of attitude towards racism is different from the attitudes, let's say, 20 years ago from black players?
Yeah, listen, these boys are much more richer, more wealthier. Some of the stuff that, say, John Barnes or, say, Cyril Regis, when he played for England, and he got a bullet through his door, you know? These things, it's a different kind of fish, different times. Again, with social media, you can hide behind it, but it depends on how these boys see it and if it's really their problem. Because as much as they endure racism, they're wealthy, so they can turn a blind eye to it, I guess. I don't know, possibly.
That is a factor. I've spoken to a footballer before who's literally said, well, I got racist abuse thrown at me, but I'm going back to my mansion and I'm warm. And I said to him, well, cost of living crisis, don't do that. But, you know, at the same time, I kind of understand where you're coming from. And Derek, I'll come to you. Kind of, we've spoken about football, we've focused on football. This whole conversation is probably going to be mostly about football, but there's another love of mine, which is Formula One. And again, I went to Silverstone a couple of years ago, when Lewis crashed out Max Verstappen, I think 2021, right? That was last year. He said yes. Strong fan over there. Oh, I see you. But yeah, being in that instance, I thought I'd be really safe in that environment. I thought I've never been to a Grand Prix before. I thought this should be fine. Usually Grand Prix, upper white, middle class people. What's the worst that can happen, right? And it's like, I got racially abused, not because like I was a black woman, but because I supported Lewis Hamilton. I was in my Mercedes top, I was chilling, I saw Lewis crashed out Max. I'm like, firstly, is Max okay? He's fine? Let's go, Lewis, kind of thing, you know? But there's also racist abuse that comes with it. And with Formula One kind of being not the most ethnically diverse sport, and obviously you being a trustee in the Mission 44 as well, and being I think it's the founder of 10 Years Time, right?
CEO.
CEO of 10 Years Time. How are you working towards changing these kind of environments to allow kind of a more diverse space to avoid these kind of racial attacks?
I mean, certainly with Mission 44, their Ignite partnership with Motorsport UK and also with the Royal Academy of Engineering is trying to diversify the field and trying to, you know, get more black people and more women into engineering and those particular fields. But I think from my perspective, the aim for me is always very much on the systemic levels. You know, it is very much on the work that we are geared towards doing is essentially how do you start to change policies, practices, and behaviors within these institutions. You know, when I was, and this isn't a sporting anecdote, but I was in a senior position at a particular organization, and I turned these two guys down for funding, you know, and their response to me was, oh, do you realize that black people were happier when they were in subservient positions? You know, so whatever layer that you're in, you are going to be experiencing various forms of institutional racism. So that's the monkey chart in the boardroom. You know, that is the banana thrown on the field of play across the boardroom. So very much for us, one, there is a piece about just acknowledging it. Yeah, not trying to use different types of words and DEI terms and everything. It's about acknowledging institutional racism. And that's what we do with a lot of our clients. We talk a lot to our clients around racial capitalism. We talk to them about how wealth was accumulated in this country and the after effects of what we have in society today and why we are positioned and situated. So we go back through the historical roots with every client that we talk to. Some like it, some don't. But if we don't go to that level, then the ability to A, get them to start undoing some of their harms in terms of their own policies, the way that they invest resources, etc., we won't get an opportunity to undo that. And then we can start looking at how you invest and how you change. But we have to start, for us personally, from really looking at racial capitalism, really looking at the root causes of these issues, and really looking at how you, within your business or your organization, are complicit, and starting to own that. Because once you get from that perspective, then you can start doing something about it.
I think that deserves a round of applause, yeah. It is all kind of deeply rooted, and we need to start from the bottom and kind of try to renew everyone's mindset in these kind of environments. And I say sports, the audience of sports is getting younger and younger every generation, right? I've got my little cousins who are watching football, watching MMA, and they're like 6 and 7. I'm like, how do you even understand the rules? When I was your age, I didn't even know what offside was, you know what I mean? And I kind of just want to ask you, Derek, is it important to kind of have that representation, seeing them on the screen for these young children? And obviously, Simone, I'll come to you with that same question after.
Yeah, it's important on the screen, but as I said, it's also important in the press room, it's also important in the boardroom, it's also important in decision-making positions in philanthropy. You know, if you look at how sport is funded, what type of sports get the most money, what types of sports require more access, and how you need people in multiple positions. So you kind of need to flood it from every single angle. So it's great that you might have more black and brown commentators, you know, on television or also on the field of play, but it's off the field of play and where those decisions are made, which are really, really important. So that's what I would like to see. I would, you know, that's what I would love to see in 5 or 10 years' time, wherever it is just to see where that representation, as I said, in the press room, and where that starts to really inject into the culture of sport, the culture of cricket, for example. I know we're talking about football a lot, but you know, cricket is also a long-standing, hugely problematic sport in terms of who's governed it, but also if you go historically through how that's been covered in the press, you would be horrified to see that some of the most mainstream journalists, what they have said historically. So it's across the board where I would want to see all that level of representation.
And Simone, I will come to you, but I am aware that, Simon, you would need to be leaving us a bit earlier. So I do want to just ask you a final question for yourself. Your company, they're producing a report, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about this report and why it's important to have this report at this particular moment in time?
So the best person to ask, by the way, is Dan out there, who you can ask afterwards.
I'll ask you, Dan, afterwards.
Great piece of work. But look, one of the things we wanted to look at was, sorry, this very topic, not only the institutional racism in sport, but what the law covers, what the law doesn't cover, where the gaps are, where the issues are, why, and the very things we've been talking about, but obviously with a legal perspective on it. Why is it important? I think, if I can have just like 1 minute before I do go off to tell a story about that. So it relates to the Euros, and it relates to why I think it's important that law firms speak out. But it's true of lots of other businesses too. It's true of financial services, industry. I really endorse what was just said there, because it isn't just about role models on pitches. It's all the way through organisations. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So when I was at the Euro final with my son, I wasn't invited by anyone. A group of us got together. We were so excited that it was really going to come home. Not that it did in the end, but we put some money together and we got a hospitality box, and it's a great privilege to do that. And the young lad who was in there, and he was working with his colleague. He was a black kid, and he was 18. And I said to him, he was also called Daniel as it happened. I said, what are you doing? So I'm going to university. I said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to Cambridge. I went, well, that's funny. I went to Cambridge. I said, what are you going to read? He said, law. I said, I read law. He said, well, what do you do? I said, I'm the head of a big law firm. Now, at this point, he clearly thought I was taking the piss, right? I mean, because it just seemed too much of a coincidence. So I sort of showed him who I was. And I said, why don't you come in and, before you go up to Cambridge, why don't you come in and have a look around? He was from the East End of London. His mum and dad no one in his family had ever gone to university, let alone had a profession. And he said, really? I said, no, come in. I want you to meet some people. You know, I'd love you to see what we do at DLA Piper. And so he came in. And he had a day going around the office meeting people. And at the end, we went for a coffee together. And I said, what do you think, Daniel? And he said, it was really strange. The people were normal. And I said, well, what did you think they were going to be? He said, well, when I told my mum and dad I'd met you and we were coming, she said, they're not going to want people like you. And that's a massive problem. It is, I mean, we do a lot of outreach as well at a firm, but it's big problem, whether it's for a big law firm or big bank or big industry or big professional sporting body, whatever it happens to be. You have to start dispelling those myths. And part of the point that was made about having people in the boardroom and stuff is a really right, excellent point, because if the only people you see are other people and it's no one who gets to in charge or control or senior parts of that organisation, it's a problem. So, you know, I think it is really important that a lot of large organisations stand up and be counted. I freely admit, I'm sure there's a gazillion things more that we could do, but we do want to stand up and be counted, and if there's anything we can do about it, we want to play our role in it.
So I turned my microphone off for a second, but yeah, that's actually very important. And one thing I do say that's really important in society as a whole is allyship, right? Where can you kind of provide that allyship to somebody who may not get an opportunity? And if you are in a position to give that opportunity, can you give that opportunity? Yes, I can. Okay, prove that you can, which is really nice of you. That story really warmed my heart, actually. So thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
But Simone, I'll swing it back over to you, just about kind of representation on the screen. I look at things like the Women's Euros. Yeah, let's have an honest conversation. Women's Euros. I was happy it came home. By the way, the man them couldn't do it, so the girls did, and I love that for us. Yes. Bashment horns everywhere, meh, all of that. But honestly, the women did it, and I was at the Euros and I went with Nike. They invited me down. They're like, let's all celebrate, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, we're celebrating. Final whistle comes through. It was absolutely amazing. But then there's kind of like that 1 second of realization that, oh my God, where are the black players in this place? There's no black players here. And I'm a firm believer of being the change that you want to be. But I'm 26, I'm ready in my career, I don't go to the gym, I can't, I can't get into football right now. Well, I'm just lazy, right? I don't want to get into football right now. But how is the PFA kind of working towards having more representation, especially in the WSL and within women's football as a whole?
Yeah, very important question and point. Intersectionality is everything. We recognised the Euros squad ahead of the Euros. There was an incident whereby something was put out kind of talking about women's football, and there was no black players talking, and we know there are black players in the game. We work with them. I've recently got a new addition to my team, a former player called Fern Whelan, who is fantastic. She's doing great work at Sky 2. She is obviously really close with all of the players. They were like up in arms about the fact that there hadn't been any black representation in this film. So what we do good, like we said already about the Enough campaign, and look, we're very good at kind of rallying the troops and getting some kind of important and key messages around campaigning. So Fern came up with the See It, Achieve It campaign. One of the things she was tasked with when she joined the organisation was to work with the black players who were there and kind of do a kind of networking. I'm all about peer-to-peer mentoring and support, so it was very much about kind of identifying who those black players were and working with them. And then from that it evolved the See It, Achieve It campaign, which we launched ahead of the Euros. So it was about working with those players who are in the WSL, elevating them, and also making them very visible for younger players coming through, a lot of kind of mentoring work with the younger players. It's a system that's worked that we've done also with Asian inclusion, so for kind of male Asian pros in the game. So that's worked really well, and this will work well, and I just feel like it's unfortunate. When I started back in 2000 in Fulham with the first women's pro team, we had Rachel Yankee, we had Mary Phillip, we had Sancha Duncan, we had a lot of, and obviously Hope Powell has been the England manager, but it's just somehow as the game has grown, that kind of intersectionality and importance of ensuring representation has not happened, but that we're on it and we're going to make sure that it's addressed.
I'm happy that you said that you're on it and you're going to make
On
sure.
it.
Yes, because I'm going to be emailing you in about 2 years, like, hi Simone, what have you done since then? But yeah, no, and honestly, I would like to know kind of the steps that have been taken kind of from the Euros to now towards kind of creating a more diverse, not England team, because obviously everyone has to go through somewhere, but kind of bringing more young, ethnically diverse, I want to say black women, because they are kind of close to my heart, and I work with a lot of young black women who kind of say they dropped out of football because their hair was different, or they got told that they got an attitude problem because, you know, they have the passion in the game, but to them it's a attitude problem. How can we kind of encourage these young girls to get back on it, and what are the PFA doing to do that?
That's really interesting because we're the Players Union, we kind of represent the pro game and our membership. So one of the things that I do is go in and talk to players. We deliver ED&I workshops, and when we deliver them to the WSL squads, we have a very specific WSL programme. And because the majority of WSL squads are white with maybe just one black or mixed heritage player within those, we do have that conversation about hair, about microaggressions. And it's been really interesting and really important just because, you know, you can only work with what you've got. So for me, it's really important that we're working with the professional players who are our members to ensure that they're empowered, they can be allies, they understand those microaggressions, they understand how it feels to be the only black person in a squad. Those conversations are really important. In terms of the pipeline coming through, that's an FA issue, but I know that there is work going on around player development centres, which will ensure that there are better, kind of a more diverse pipeline coming through. But I also think it's really key that we see more black female coaches and people around the squads, whether that's player care, whether that's physios, whether that's doctors, whether that's the comms people. It's that whole representation side of things is so key. And don't get me started on the media because that's a whole another conversation.
I know I really apologise. I have to leave now, so I'm gonna leave you three to the hard questions from the audience, which I apologise. And any really clever question about law, you can ask Daniel out there. But I do apologise. If it's any consolation, I'm now going to a meeting at Parliament, so at least I've got a bunch of people I can now tell all about what we've just been talking about here. Maybe they'll do something, but this was a wonderful event, so thank you for inviting me, and apologies for leaving early.
Thank you, Simon. And on that note, I guess we kind of will end it there and open the floor up. Simone, Leon, Derek, Simon, who's walking away. But thank you so much for having this conversation, and if anybody has any questions... Oh, hello. Should I bring the microphone over? Yep.
Hi, so I'm Anita from Show Races and the Red Card.
Hi, Anita.
I was really thank you so much. It was so rich, what the panel's contributions. But one thing that really stood out to me was this idea of performative. And my question, I guess, to all of you is how concerned are you about the performative nature of anti-racism, and what ways are there, in your opinion, that we go beyond performative? Because it's something that I'm finding really hard in my work context and personal context, is how we go beyond the performative, because to some extent I feel we need the performative.
Leon, I guess we'll start with you. We'll go around.
It's difficult. I mean, you're talking about an idea and a systemic problem. So, for instance, we're talking about some players. So it's universally accepted that If you're an ex-professional football player and you're white, you're going to get a job at top level. So say Steven Gerrard or Frank Lampard. But then you've got someone just as good as Sol Campbell, because he's extravagant, he can't get a job at a high level. He can get a job at a small level, but take John Barnes. He hasn't had a job since, I think, Tranmere. So it's about ownership. I think until people of colour start owning stuff, that ain't going to change anytime soon. And you look at it globally around the world, there's no ownership. No one owns any football club. The best club for me at the moment, progressive for players of different backgrounds and cultures, is QPR. Massively, I think 80% of their players or coaches and coach team are black or ethnic. But that's one club in hundreds. So how do you change that mindset? Because unless you own something, you can't change it. You can put things in place, and they then become tokenisms. But you can't change a condition that's been there for years.
That was extremely strong. Do you both have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to... So I feel for you in terms of that, because we see it so often. And the thing is, when you see these performative actions, it's very easy for everyone to think that good things are happening. But actually nothing really changes. I mean, I think as a decent example, we've seen more moves in like the WNBA in terms of who owns the clubs, who's got ownership there, the voices of women in terms of various issues from racial justice to mental health to LGBTQ plus issues, and how they've mobilized around things. You've started to see where they've moved from some of more performative actions a few years ago to something that really is starting to touch on who owns the clubs and who should own those basketball franchises. They've started to move towards having a social justice council, and a social justice council that brings in expertise from the outside to be able to support that. So yes, they might still wear the shirts and have the other things that look good, you know, in terms of the television screen, but there is other moves that's happening behind that, which is a little slower, but stuff that's happening behind that is slightly more systemic. Again, I'm not saying that that's perfect, but I am saying that at least there is a dual strategy there that says, yeah, the performative stuff might be able to bring in the attention, but they're doing something more systemically to be able to do that. And some of that comes down to just resourcing it, centralizing it, and bringing in the expertise or some additional expertise to be able to support the ways in which it's centralized, and also like layers of accountability. And right now, I don't see where there is high levels of accountability for anyone in power to be able to do anything around it. So there isn't any incentive to do anything other than to manage the news. So that's what we see all of the time. You know, if a black player gets abused, like Marcus Rashford and Bukayo Saka were abused after the game recently, you know. So they got, you know, Marcus Rashford for not scoring the goal from the free kick at the end of the game was abused for that. You know, if that's happened, for the authorities, that becomes news management. It doesn't become any level of accountability on their part or any incentives to really change it systemically.
Simone, anything to add?
No, both of you have really summed it up. I just think that the campaign and I think the performative is very important. I think the Iranian team not singing their national anthem is really impactful. I've been really had a lot with players taking the knee that has had a massive impact with kind of kids and people who work in the NHS. It's been really, really powerful. And I think that athlete advocacy is a really big next step. We've seen what Rashford has done. There's your friend who said that he's going to just go home and not worry because he's got lots of money. Like Leon said, that ownership piece I think is really key now, and to empower our athletes to understand that they can be the game changers will be a big step, and I think we're close to seeing that. And I also strongly feel that in terms of holding people to account within the kind of stakeholders is the only way that we're going to see change.
Amazing. No problem. Yes.
Just two quick things. On the performative side, institutions, organizations need to accept that there is a systemic problem, right? So when I look at something like the Premier League, who don't even countenance anything, even looking at the Rooney Rule, right? They're not even, that says a lot about the blind spots, the blindness they have to this issue, and I think we need to make sure that we call that out. But on the sort of ownership side, because I totally believe, I'm a Packers fan, it's a community-owned football club in America, black owners in there, and I just think if the players, if 2 Hollywood actors can own a football club here, we could come together and pool we're not a wealthy community, but if we come together, we can be a really wealthy community to have the funds to invest in a club or two that is truly representative, and I think that's an effort we need to really spend time on. And Derek, you spend a lot of time on wealth advisory, helping people understand where they can put their money to do good. And this has got to be a space where we can pool our money and put our money to do good. And we as a community could get behind it. I'm willing to put my whatever bucks in there to make it happen. And I'm sure lots of other people would too.
A response to that? I think that was pretty powerful in itself as a standalone, yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I agree because, there needs to be, as I said, you have to be in those positions to be able to make those particular changes. And if you're not in there, we are seeing more of that with American sports stars. But I also, the one caution, and I think I agree with you here, it's you have to pool the money because the level of wealth that we're talking about is not on the same level through earning money through sports as it is through some of the other ownership. So there's got to be ways, there's got to be different incentives. It's not the full answer, but I think it is part of the answer in terms of how that starts to change. And I think also, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Renee Montgomery from the WNBA is now a part owner of a team now, after some of the campaigning she was doing last year. And I think that was some of the stuff that the WNBA did to enable that to be able to happen or to open that pathway. So, I don't want to put it all on players, to be able to do that. There has also got to be some laws and incentives in terms of the league in order to make some of that happen.
Yep, brilliant. Is there any other questions? Oh my, there's loads of questions. You guys are very popular. We'll go around.
I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, for just the whole conversation and how sort of practical it was, because I sort of work in academia, so I'm used to more post-colonialism and all those nice isms, but no actual real practical, live stuff. I guess my question was mainly just in terms of, the Colin Kaepernick effect and just whether there can be more protection for players who are kind of, because I kind of see, blackness even in the same way as LGBT, as in is there protection for players who desire to come out, or is there protection for players who desire to be openly black and confident even? And even, the comment that you made, being able to say, yes, I'm not a monkey, because it's little things like that whereby, what happened to Colin after he simply took the knee. So I feel I wonder whether there can be more discussions about the sort of political protection for each player so that they can not have to sort of, lose sort of things, but at the same time they can still be comfortable and actually focus on the game, which, what Michael Jordan would always say, but again, he was famous for having to completely steer clear of politics. So I think that's my question. Thank you.
I can tackle it because it was something that came up quite a lot when, obviously, post George Floyd's murder, then the Premier League captains had a conversation kind of with the PFA and the Premier League to talk about taking the knee. And then the EFL also said that that players in the EFL would take the knee, but it wasn't kind of uniform. So some clubs did, some clubs didn't. Some black players wanted to take the knee, but were booed. Some black players felt that they couldn't because no one else did. So it was a kind of quite a challenging time in terms of working with the clubs, supporting the players to do, you know, their freedom, and to be able to kind of navigate that space, because some of the fans were brutal, particularly kind of lower down in the league. So, I mean, I think it's maybe going back to that athlete advocacy and just kind of like the importance of making players not just at the top of the game, not just the multimillionaires in the Premier League, but those lower down and lower leagues, to kind of empower them. And like we talked about the WSL players and the few black women within those squads, just to really make sure that they are protected. And you're right, it is very similar to kind of ensuring in terms of an LGBTQ plus player.
Yeah, on that one for Colin Kaepernick, you think about a mixed heritage boy brought up by white parents, decided to use his platform as a black man to obviously come out against racial brutality against unarmed black and brown people, right? So, but you got the president of the United States then calling him a son of a bitch. But that gives people freedom to do what they want. I mean, that man hasn't had a job since in the NFL. He hasn't played since. Darkly after, I think, 9-10 months afterwards, George Floyd happens, and that's what he was protesting against. So if it hasn't changed in society and laws are written, so you think about, I look at Lewis Hamilton not getting that championship 2 years ago. A law was changed for him not to get that. A law was changed. That came out for him not to progress. So unless we change it in society, and it's a society problem, it's not going to change on a grander scale. You get little nuances and little changes, but again, Colin Kaepernick hasn't had a game in the NFL since he protested. And he asked a white army officer, how can I silently protest? So he's done everything right, but yet got everything so wrong, because he hasn't... I look at the hours of training he's done to become a player and not being able to do that again, it's ridiculous for me. It's heartbreaking.
The only thing I was going to add, so absolutely there needs to be more protection for players and particularly from the press. And I absolutely adore that there is more athlete activism, which is, you know, different from many, many years ago. But, you know, ultimately, you know, I'm not saying to my son, watch this footballer to tell me stuff about the law or about racism in society, you know. So I also caution, one thing where I say, great, I love the fact that the athletes are you know, more activist than before, but they are also athletes, you know, and they are there to perform, to excel in the sports that they do, not necessarily to switch and be able to, you know, represent and be the spokesperson of A, B, C, D. Because if that becomes the issue, there's very few athletes that I've seen when they've actually really needed to dive deep into a political issue, for example, be able to, you know, really understand everything that's going on in there. And that's not to disrespect them, that's to say they're athletes, and some of them are very good at it, but the majority, you know, it's not necessarily going to be the case. So it's just me cautioning in terms of the role that athletes play in terms of some of these particular issues.
I guess I want to say just one last thing. I totally agree, and I think, you know, the main thing is it's the emotional effect, like you were saying. One, they're not politicians, and two, you know, if you look at, you know, Michael Jordan's stats, he even mentioned that being silent to the media made sure that he was loud on the court and just throughout. So I just feel like there just needs to be more support and actually legislature to actually protect athletes as if they are, you know, just so that they can focus on their game, really. But then at the same time, it shouldn't be a thing where their silence equals complicity, because that's not true either. So, yeah, it's no more like...
That was a brilliant last word. Unfortunately, we do have to cut it there just for time. Hoping you will have some time to talk to a couple of our panelists afterwards. If not, we will hopefully arrange something. I don't want to say anything and then get in trouble after. So, yeah, but thank you all for joining us, and thank you to my lovely panelists. Really appreciated this conversation. Thought it was a pretty nice conversation, yeah? Okay, they're smiling, so I'm guessing yes. So yeah, round of applause for them.